Welcome to today's demo painting of Tucker Road Bend. Right here you see the final painting, and here you see the photographic reference that I worked from. So we're going to jump right in to mixing the paint that went into creating Tucker Bend. And here I'm starting out with Italian Terra Verte. That's the green that I use for the most part in painting landscapes. It's a nice thick earth color green. And I've started laying in the palette with three daubs of that Italian Terra Verte. Remember that when we mix color for painting with blocking in this alla prima technique, you're going to want to have three different values of each color. Here you're going to see that we're going to have actually a suite of values of those different greens. And in order to mix some of those other different greens, we're going to need several of those pure dye colors. Dioxazine purple is the first one that I laid out up there, also called Egyptian violet in the Williamsburg line. There's a reason I put those colors up at the top. They are staining, heavily staining. So I stick them up at the top of my palette so that I will not end up with them all over my sleeves and shirt and hands and everything else. So the next three that I have laid out are based on the Cinnabar. So those are the base colors. It's the main color value that I've seen in that particular section of green. So we're going to have some darker greens and lighter greens. And again, three sections of it, so you have three different values. Then Montserrat orange is going down. And I've gone on and put a small daub of Montserrat orange next to one of those daubs of Cinnabar green. So again, I have three areas of the Montserrat that are going to be connected both visually and physically through those pigments. Then we have the white that is going to have blue added to it to make the blues of the sky. And I'm going to have those blues mixed from several different colors, both the ultramarine blue and the phthalo blue, in different proportions. Here you see me squeezing out some Indian yellow, one of my favorite colors, a super saturated, rich, transparent yellow. From that, you can mix almost every other yellow on the palette. Then I'm also going to have a daub of yellow ochre, and I'm going to be using that to mix both one of the other light greens as well as one of the Montserrat orange values. It's going to be a little warmer and a little duller. Here up at the top, you see the ultramarine blue going down next, and then in that far right-hand corner, you'll see where I put the phthalo blue. And again, notice how far away it is from everything else. Phthalo blue is one of those colors that gets into everything, so I like to isolate it and keep those staining dye colors way far away from everything else on the palette. So there you see the colors before I've started mixing larger proportions, and you can see that in those light greens, I have one that is almost half cinnabar green and half yellow ochre, one that's half cinnabar and half Montserrat orange. So now that I have those laid out, I'm going to start mixing up the darker values of the green. So one of my favorite combinations to make a super rich dark green is the Italian Terra Verte, and you saw about how much I squeezed out there. It's about the size of a quarter, with a small amount of Williamsburg's Egyptian violet, dioxazine purple is what it really is, added to it so that it becomes a rich, dark, greenish purple. And after I've mixed that, I take a tiny little bit of that mixture and I use it to take just a little bit of the green edge off of the pure Italian Terra Verte. Squeezed out of the tube, it's just a little bit too intense. I'm going to split that last daub of Italian Terra Verte in half and add some of it to the cinnabar green in the next line, so that the darkest cinnabar green has a large part, in proportion, has a part of the Italian Terra Verde in it. Almost every color on there is going to relate to other colors that are on the palette. That helps to keep the painting unified. So it's really important to not just squeeze colors out of the tube without connecting them some way physically through the pigment. So this section right here that you see me mixing right now is the Cinnabar Green Light mixed with almost an equal amount of yellow ochre. The Cinnabar Green Light becomes a really, really warm, slightly dulled green when you mix it with yellow ochre. And you can see when it's sitting next to that other large pile of cinnabar that I just mixed, that it is significantly warmer when you have added the yellow ochre to it. And now you see me take just a tiny little bit of that mixture I just made and put it back into that other pile of cinnabar green that had a little bit of the Italian Terra Verde in it. Again, it's that idea of making the colors visually connect. So almost never when I'm painting do you have colors that come straight out of the tube without having them adjusted in some way, shape, or form so they will speak to the color next to them on the palette. This is another one of those advantages to mixing your colors ahead, that you really are able to ensure that the colors speak to each other. So I've just mixed up that half Montserrat and half Cinnabar Green Light pile, and am now working on mixing up the Montserrat and yellow, Indian yellow. So I have colors now that will transition from those light, warm greens into warm oranges and warm neutrals. In the yellow ochre also goes some of that same kind of mixture so that it is now modified just a little bit. And it's speaking through that mixture of pigments with the Montserrat mixture to the right and the green and Montserrat mixture to the left. So now they're connected and related. These are the main colors that I'm going to use in the landscape itself, and then we're going to mix those blues together. So I start with the ultramarine blue, which tends to be a darker and warmer version of blue, and I add some of that to the white pile that I have there towards the middle. Get that thoroughly mixed, and notice how I'm turning the knife, twisting it, turning, plowing and pulling the paint so that it mixes thoroughly. I know some students have talked about how clean the palette is and how not to get paint mixed all over your hands. This is one of the ways to do that, is to make sure that you're kind of plowing and pushing with that knife, that flat edge knife. It's the best knife to use to mix. In that second pile of white, I've added a tiny little bit of the ultramarine blue and white mixture, and then gone over and gotten a little phthalo blue to add to that. So now I have two blues as well. And in just a minute, you'll see where I'm going to mix a third blue from those two blues so that I'll end up with three piles of blue, and they will all be visually connected, but they'll be a little bit different in temperature as well as in hue. So when you look at the palette here, you can see how strongly connected all these colors are, yet you have a full range with at least 3 different values of each color. So here we go with mixing that second blue. And it's going to be more phthalo blue and a little bit less of the ultramarine blue. It's going to be about halfway in between the two mixtures that I've already got. There we have it. So now we've got all of those colors established. It doesn't take that long to mix the colors ahead. Then you know how they're going to react with each other. And you have 3 different values of each color. So there's a little bit of purple in that first dark green, and a little less purple, but still a tiny little bit in the middle one. And then we have a green. So it goes all 3 closely related. Then we move to the lighter greens in the next row. mixed with cinnabar green light, but remember that first one on the far left has a little bit of the Italian terra verde in it, so it is now speaking to the row below. Then when you move from the light greens, you go into those more warm neutrals and pinks, and they all connect. Here I've got a toned panel already mounted on the foam core board. Remember, I used the loops of Scotch tape to adhere the panel to the foam core board. It's not going to fall off. I used acrylic yellow ochre and a paper towel and a little bit of water to tone that panel so that it is ready to go. But that yellow ochre makes a really great base for a landscape painting. You can use other colors as well, but yellow ochre is the color of the light in the South Carolina southeastern landscape, so that's the main reason I use it. Here I'm starting to block in the no-tan, those basic shapes, so we build up those basic dark and light value patterns right away. And I'm using that dark green violet mixture, that was the first one we mixed, to create that no-tan. Always remember that the no-tan is mixed with the color, it's created with the color, not with black and white. So quickly with that bigger knife, either the 106 or the 109, or a big brush if you're using a big brush, if you're using brushes. Go on and establish those shapes and values and especially get those big dark shapes blocked on in. You'll notice that I do not draw off my composition before I get started. That is probably not a great idea unless you've been painting a long time. I don't do it because I've been doing it a good bit. But you can use some charcoal or a small brush and some paint to just kind of indicate where those shapes go for yourself. Or you can dive in and realize you can wipe off if you don't get it exactly correct the first time. And go on and use that knife, that big knife, to establish those shapes without drawing it off first. So you can see I've got that right-hand side established, and now I'm blocking in the left-hand side of the no-tan. And always remember that you can hold that knife and move it in two directions. It doesn't have to go just one direction. You can also change the direction of your hand and of the way that you're holding the pressure onto the knife. So see how I'm using my index finger to lightly apply pressure on the knife. That's the way to control it. So make sure you're using your finger to control the pressure on the knife. And I'm not getting a whole lot of paint on there at one time. It's a fairly small amount. And that purple that's going down first, that purplish green, is going to be very thinly applied. So in almost no time at all, I've got the basic values, that basic pattern of light and dark established. And in just a short while, I'm going to be able to move on to those other values. So again, because it's oils that I'm using here, it's really easy to adjust the shapes if they need to be. You can either scrape back or add more. A little easier to do that in oils than it is with acrylics. So if you haven't tried the oils yet, I still would strongly recommend that, although the technique works very well in whatever medium you are working in, whether it is acrylic, watercolor, or oils. So look now at the photograph in the bottom left-hand corner and then at the no-tan, and you can see how quickly we're getting that established in. Remember, after you do your darkest darks, then you're going to go with those lighter lights And in this case, that has to do with the sky. So I'm going to block in that sky in almost the same amount of time it took me to block in the trees. And you can see how thin that paint is and how I am making it stay super thin by the way I apply it onto the knife. Don't put it on thick at first. It's very easy to go back and build the paint up as you decide that that's really where you want it to be. But if you put it on too thick to begin with, you're going to have to scrape back and remove an awful lot of paint. So I've started with that darker blue at the top, and we'll gradually move down. And this is what I call the dance back and forth, so the push and the pull. So I am pushing the blue off of the purple that went onto that purple in the process of applying the paint. So I wasn't worried about the edges of the shape because I knew that I could go back in and tweak it. And that tweaking process actually really is the thing that it makes the painting achieve the real interesting edges that a palette knife painting can get. Actually, the same thing can happen with a brush, but you just kind of want to dance back and forth between the light and the dark. It helps to break up the dark shape, and it helps to add visual interest and texture to the rest of the painting. So here you see me going on and applying the phthalo blue mixture, the lighter of the blue mixtures that I made, and turning the panel so that I can work on a different edge. Notice I'm holding it in my hand at this point rather than having it on the easel. It gets easier to me to make big marks and to make expressive marks when the panel is not attached to the easel. Again, that's one of those personal preference things that you have to figure out whether or not it's going to work for you. Once I've gotten that sky laid in, I now have a value for those basic shapes. I'm going to go over to the left and work on blocking in some of the lighter green values. So I'm working back and forth across the whole composition at one time. It's a light green, but it still is going to end up actually being almost a middle value green. Think back to that palette and the fact that we had 3 of the greens on there that were mixtures with the cinnabar green light. This is the one on the left. So we have 2 that are lighter than this. So you work from thin to thick and from dark to light. So those underlying layers are much thinner and much darker than the top layers. And you can see that the top layer of that light green is going on much thicker than the other layers. And to put that on, I hold the knife almost flat. It is almost completely on its side. Now we're adding in the light value of the road that is illuminated in sunlight, and I've made it a little bit bigger than it was in the photograph. Remember, you don't have to be tied completely to what you see in a photograph. You get to change and make choices in your compositions. So if you think it's going to work better to make a shape larger, do it. And here the push-pull goes on again, that dance back and forth. So I'm removing some of the blue so that that large green shape makes more visual sense and becomes a little bit more complex. And then if I've scraped off a little bit too much, or if I need to cover up a streak of green that's gotten into the blue, I will pull some fresh paint onto the knife and pull it across the painting. Notice I've gone from working with a large knife to working with a smaller knife here for the details. And I'm also using that knife to, again, work out some of the paint that has gotten a little blurred or a little smudged in one area or another. as the lighter values go over the darker ones. Next, I'm going to go over here and do that same dance back and forth with that distant line of trees. Going back and forth like this gives those tree edges a chance to blend a little bit and not be too hard, harsh, and sharp. Super important to not just lay that shape down and leave those edges alone. Edges in a painting really can make a very big difference. So here I'm adding that warmer green where the sunlight has hit to the edge of the trees in the distance, and a little bit in the tree on the left-hand side where the sunlight is again hitting it. Because I'm going around a bend right there, the trees on the left have more illumination on them than the trees on the right. A little tweaking back and forth with those areas that need to be broken up a little bit more so that there's a transition between the light trees in the background and the deep, dark silhouette of the tree on the right. Now it's time to break up that shape of the light that's falling on the road so that it has a little bit more variation. And you saw me take a little bit darker, that's that Montserrat orange mixed with yellow ochre, and added that to the road as like a shadow. It's not really a strong shadow, but more of a variation in the color of the road itself. And here I am going in and breaking up the ground at the bottom of the painting so that the road that is in deep shadow begins to take some form. Carrying some of that medium green right on up into the edge of the trees on the left-hand side. So at this stage, it's a tweaking back and forth, kind of that constant dance between how much you put on and how much you take off. Think of taking paint off as being just as important as putting paint down. Keep the urge to add lots of details at the get-go kind of suppressed a little bit so that you have a chance to really work on those big basic shapes. And here you just saw me add the Montserrat orange to the road. Notice that it was not the orange pink color mixed with white. So many people, when they're trying to create a sense of illumination, will simply mix the color with white. That doesn't really make for a strong sense of light. Having a contrast between slightly duller colors and more intense colors will create that strong sense of illumination. So that's why you see almost pure color on the edge of the road there where the light's hitting it. And I'm going back in here and working those green shapes some more so that the patterns of lights and darks in the foliage begin to make more visual sense. And the tiny little shapes that are those thin trees that were in the very background part of the photograph are what's going in now. There is a clearing on the far side of the road made from a clear cut. That's an area where there are a lot of tree farms, and it had been clear cut a couple of years ago. So it left this huge opening in the bend of the road where there had been a lot of green foliage. So that Those little thin trees were one of the things that really interested me about that particular photograph, partially because I remembered what the more forested section had looked like. And I'm going back in here and putting a warmer, lighter, slightly lighter version of the green onto the trees on the left. Again, you can see that in the photo up in the top left, where you have warm, light greens where the light is hitting it, and cool, dark greens where the light is not. Then next, we're going to finish up those values in the trees, finesse and tweak some of those edges, and pull that lighter value down further into the composition. Next, we're going to move over to that right-hand side where the trees in the shade have a little bit of light hitting them at the top. The trees on the left get most of the sunlight, but the trees on the right are getting a little tiny bit right just at the very top where the sun's making its way over the edge of those tops and a little around the bend. So have that warm green in there first. Notice how I'm turning the board that I'm working on so that I can get the better angle to apply the paint. Don't be afraid to twist and turn the painting, pick it up, move it around, hang it upside down, whichever angle is going to help you get the best mark, the most appropriate mark for what you're trying to do. So I've switched knives here to the smaller one because I'm pulling some paint off. So don't be afraid to pull paint off. You're not wasting it. You get marks and variations from pulling paint off that you can't get any other way. So it's not wasted at all. Put it to the side on your palette. Use it to create your own really interesting gray values and gray colors. Much richer than if you squeezed gray out of the tube. So still pulling off a little bit of that dark and tweaking the edge between the tree and the sky. Then I'm going to be taking some of the more intense green and adding that in just a few minutes to the top of that band of trees. So use that small knife to finesse the thickness and the texture of your darker areas, or your lighter areas for that matter. Always keeping in mind to wipe the knife with a paper towel in between each stroke so that you're not picking up and transferring a lot of color from one area to another. The same thing would hold true for a brush. So as you move the brush across the canvas, you want to use a paper towel to wipe it periodically so that you're not picking up and moving paint from one area to another. So again, I'm using that smaller knife just to go back in and tweak shapes and edges and make sure they make visual sense. We are almost finished with the painting. So it's just a matter of finessing a handful of smaller edges and shapes and forms. So you can use both the back side of the knife to put paint down and the front side of the knife to pull paint off. And there we have it. We have the final painting. So let's look at that photograph again, and next to it the finished painting. Thank you so much for being with me here today, and I hope you have enjoyed this demo on color mixing and palette knife painting. Happy painting!